Hello and welcome. Thanks for joining us this morning for our trout fishing tips for the Blue River. I've added into the chat bar already some how-to videos that we've recorded already that are bait fishing and artificial lures, fly fishing, fishing lakes and ponds. That way, we can kind of just focus specifically on Blue River and not go through all of the different baits and lures that you may or may not use. I'm just going to touch on what I have the most success with at the river, what I think is kind of the easiest lures and baits that you can use to get set up quickly and get into good numbers of fish every time that you get out there. And I'm also going to talk about kind of where you might look to fish when you're at Blue River. Please use the chat bar throughout the course if you have questions about anything, what I'm talking about, question about Blue River, lure, anything like that, and we'll just address questions as we go. So to get started, we're just going to kind of go through the river itself and where you may look to fish and what you would use to be successful. So we'll start off on the north end of the property. So Blue River is almost 6.5 miles of continuous public river. There are several access sites along the river, the most popular being down around the camp area where the uh, property's headquarters are located at. But you can pretty much access all 6.5 miles of the river fairly easily. There are trails on both sides of the river for the most part. There's a few breaks where you have to do a little bit of bushwhacking if you wanted to get to every part of the property, but usually not necessary. You can get to most of the best spots on the property just on well maintained stalking roads and trails that are out there. Is the river down? Yeah, I mean, we've been in drought for going on a year now, so flows are going to be a little bit low. You can always go on to wildlifedepartment.com or check out our fishing report and check out what the CFS is. But typically at this time of year, it's going to be running somewhere in the 100s, unless we get a little bit of rain. But I can check that right now and see what we're running at. The nearest stream gauge for Blue River is in Connorville, which is just north of the property. So it gives you a really good estimate of what kind of water is coming into the property. Anytime you look at a stream gauge, you kind of want to be looking upriver. And Connorville does a good job of showing us where that's at. Looks like they picked up a little bit of rain in the last day or so. So river's up a little bit, but still probably right now below average of where it's typically at this time of year. So for Blue River, we'll start with the north end of the property, which is where the catch and release zone is at. So there's two parking areas on the west side of the river if you're up off of Highway 7. The first one is well off of the river. So that's going to be about it's a pretty good walk. I don't know if I can get a walking trail coordinate on it, but it looks to be that it's about a mile. So if you were to utilize the walk-in only parking lot, which is on the western end, before you hit the river on Highway 7 on the north side of the road, you would just walk that and it'll take you straight to the catch and release zone. There's also another parking area a little bit farther to the east that's almost on the river, and that will also take you up to the catch and release zone. But it will get to the river quicker. So after about an eighth of a mile, maybe a quarter of a mile, you're going to come onto the river, and then you're going to walk the river for at least a half a mile, maybe a little bit more before you get to the catch and release zone. And along the way, the big thing to pay attention to at Blue River when you're fishing, especially for trout, is all of those maintained trails that are along the river's edge are hauling roads. So that's where the stocking trucks with trout are going to travel. So one of the key things to pay attention to is where are there access points for the trucks to reach the river? There's typically along those trails, you'll see a notched out section that is, you know, truck size, maybe a little bit bigger, that's right up along the bank. It may be a steep bank in some cases because the trouts do come out of tubes. So, you know, they can get launched in. The truck tires don't need to be touching the water. But anywhere where you see kind of turnoffs on those main trails is where fish are going to go in. And because they're a seasonal stocked fish, and the way that Blue River is composed with waterfalls, there's natural barriers. So in every section where where those fish are put, they end up staying in those sections, unless you end up with major flooding events during the winter months where they can move around a little bit and maybe get to areas that they otherwise couldn't. They're typically stuck in between waterfall routes. They won't go up and over them or down river of them without any type of flow. Why is there a gate on the other side of Hughes Crossing by the other campsites? I'm not sure. You can contact our Blue River biologist down there. His name is Ethan Lovelace, and he can get you hooked up. I'll put his contact information in here. You can find all of our department contacts at wildlifedepartment.com under our contact us button, and you can click on department contacts and then just type in Blue River and you will find our people who work down there. But the office number for Ethan is right here in the chat bar if you've got questions about the property itself. So again, if you're going up those stocking roads and you're just looking at these areas, the north end of the property, so the north section is going to be what's above Highway 7. It doesn't get as much pressure as the southern part of the property, just due to the fact that you do have to do a little bit of walking. There's not as readily available fishing right out of your vehicle as there is on the southern part of the property. So, in most cases, what I recommend is if you really want to get adventurous, if you're, you know, by yourself or with a partner, and you got bikes are a great option. You can ride cut down on a lot of the time to get up to the catch and release zone and some of those farther north areas. If you do plan on going to the catch and release zone, it is best to access it from the west side of the river. You can get there from the east side of the river following the trail, but it is going to require some deeper wading as well as a little bit of bushwhacking through islands. The water is too deep up there from the east bank to cross on waterfalls or on maintained trails. So you kind of have to skirt yourself along the edges and use some ditches. And then once you get up into the catch and release zone, it gets braided out and you're able to wade across either the waterfall rocks or the water shallow enough that you can get across. So if you do plan on going up to the catch and release zone, it's easiest to get there from one of the two western entrances. And if you want to fish your way up there, then parking in the secondary parking lot, which is the one that's closest to the river. And I can throw a link up to that in the chat bar. So this is just a URL to Google Maps, and that's going to put you in the secondary parking lot. That is going to be the trail, and it's going to get you on the river fairly quickly, and you can fish your way up. And eventually that trail will come all the way down kind of to a dead end area, and you can bushwhack your way through, or you can cut over to the left. And I will put a link in the chat bar for that as well, where that trail kind of ends. You can stay along the riverbank and it will eventually bump you back into the catch and release trail. And there is some fishing through there, but it's usually best if you don't want to get lost or you don't really want to go bushwhacking with gear or things like that, to just kind of follow the road around there to the left. And that will hook up with the walk-in area parking lot that I talked about that stays way off of the river until it gets all the way to the catch and release zone. And then once you're up in the catch and release zone, it pretty much ends where that trail ends. And you'll notice that there is a property to the east side of the river, and that's private property. And that's where our access to the river ends. But there's some good holes that are up there in the catch and release zone. It's braided pocket water. trucks are able to make a couple of good stockings along that. So typically by December, January, there's quite a few fish that are up there. Obviously, it's catch and release. So only way fish would be dying is of natural predation or through just angling mortality when fish are released. So right along that river bank, there's a couple of really good holes on the west side of the bank, and you can see it on Google Map, and you can definitely see it when you're on the water there. But along that western edge, there's lots of just pretty short sections. That's another thing at Blue River to have success. If you notice on the north end of the property, so the area that's not in the catch and release, which is the south boundary of the catch and release, all the way downstream to the Highway 7 bridge, I will throw up the link to that parking area. So that's going to be on the east side of the river, and that's going to give you pretty good access to some good holes all the way up to just before the catch and release zone. It's well maintained. There's easy access. You can do a little bit of wading. You can get out on the waterfalls. The only thing in this section, for the most part, outside of a few holes that you can find that are fairly well confined, is you do have longer runs in this part of the property, which means when fish get stocked, they can spread out a lot farther. They don't have the natural barriers that they do in some of the southern portions of the property or the catch and release zone, where they are very restricted by waterfalls. So because they are seasonal fish and they're not in here year round, looking to target areas that a stocking truck could get to stock, that is fairly short in distance between the waterfall upstream and the waterfall downstream, is just going to put you on more fish more often, especially if you're fly fishing or if you're utilizing artificial lures, where you probably are going to be moving around a lot more than if you were bank angling. If you're looking to do some bank fishing with bait, then you don't really need to go much farther than those parking areas. Those first couple of waterfalls, that come out from the parking area on the east side, or even the west side if you wanted to make a little bit of a walk up to one of those runs, but you don't have to go much farther than that. Power bait is going to be your best bet. Maybe some corn if you want to do that, but some type of floating power egg, power bait that you're using on small snelled hooks, or size 10 through size 14 egg hooks or treble hooks. Those are going to be your best bet for using bait. And right there along the river, that's going to kind of be your best accesses right there. But if you want to use artificial lures or flies, traveling a little bit farther upstream, you're going to notice that there are some sections of the river that trucks can get to stock fish that are in little pockets that are surrounded by these waterfall areas. And you're going to be able to pull out several fish out of those and then continue to move to where you should be trying to fish the Blue River, if you are for numbers, by hitting each little pocket, catching as many fish as you can. And if let's say you catch 3 or 4 fish out of the same hole, but then you're not really getting bit for 10 or 15 minutes, it's probably time to move on. You've either spooked fish, you've caught all the fish that are in that little hole. But those braided sections, especially the farther upstream you get on that northern property and then into the catch and release, that's where you're going to see your heavier catch rates. Now, just south of the Highway 7 bridge are 2 parking areas as well, one on the east side of the river and one on the west side of the river. The west side of the river gives you a trail down to 2 fairly good areas that have fish. There's also the one on the east side of the road. So I'm going to throw a link to the west side of the road. And that one, you follow that trail down and it kicks out into 2 decent spots below 2 waterfalls. So you could follow that trail all the way down to where it dead ends, and you'll notice there's a waterfall right there, and you can fish that section. And then if you go upstream just a little bit, about halfway between the end of that road and the parking area, is another good section of waterfalls. There's kind of a sandy beach in there. It's a good place that you could set up with artificial lures, fly fishing, or with bait. The parking area that I'm going to throw the link into now for the east side of the river kind of limits you to one fishing spot that is probably going to be better suited for people who are bait fishing. Not a lot of room right there to be able to spread out. But you'll notice that there's a trail that kicks down to the end of what was a long run that goes underneath the Highway 7 bridge. And that pulls you down. Fish that get stocked up above the bridge end up tailing downstream, and then they get stuck behind that waterfall. So that's kind of covers the north end of the property. Again, if you have any questions about the river fishing or otherwise as we go along, please throw those in the chat box. So now let's move down to what is kind of the heart of the property, the central part of the property around the campgrounds, that southern boundary. So I'm going to start with the Desperado Springs area, which if you come into the main portion of the campground area and you hook up left up a hill, there's a parking area up there that is where Desperado Spring is at. And there is a well-maintained trail on that as well that goes probably close to a mile, maybe more. And then it loops back around. So it's one big loop. So when you go down towards the river, you want to make sure that as you're coming out of that parking area, you stay to the right to get on the river. Right when you reach the river, there is a pretty good hole that's just right along the riverbank right there that most people try to get to first, but you can bank angle from there. I'm going to throw that in the chat box, just where that little spot is at. But there's lots of good braided sections up through there. So as you walk the trail and you notice areas where a truck could get to, once you get through the real thick braided spots right above where I put the link to that hole, there's some pretty good sections that are up through there. You could take a bike into that, or you could walk all of the trails, these roads that are through there. There's not much of an elevation change, not really much in the way of hard hiking. It's pretty flat. Can get muddy at times, and especially if you're walking in waders and boots. Make sure if you don't have comfortable waders or comfortable boots that you have broken in, you may not want to take the 1 mile walk in there. You're going to end up with some blisters. But if you got comfortable hip boots or anything that you're used to, walking is fine. Otherwise, taking a bike is great because the trail or the roads are pretty well maintained. But that section that goes through there and up above, there's some good runs, and you have immediate access to the river right there from the bank side. So when you get up all the way to the top, that road is going to kick back around and it's going to loop back. So you can pretty much fish your way up to the end, and then you can take a scenic walk back to your vehicle, or you can come right back down the way you came and fish your way back. So in the chat bar, the link right there is going to take you to where the end of that road is. And there is a good little waterfall right there and a nice section to fish along that. That comes down, and there's again areas where those fish can really spread out through there because there's boulder runs as opposed to waterfalls. So all of that braided section that goes downstream until it hits the next real big group of waterfalls is going to have trout in it. They're going to be able to move through that without high flows. So those are the types of sections that you look to get in and wade, because there's pocket water and nice little seams that you can get into. And those fish are able to kind of navigate their way through there. So you can find some honey holes back in there that most people aren't willing to get to just because of the walk in and maybe unfamiliarity with the river itself. But that's really what you're looking for on Blue River, is areas that go into braided sections that don't have waterfalls, that are near to where a hauling truck could either stock downstream or upstream. And those fish are able to kind of move in and start to set up shop in these different little types of pocket water. And that's when if you're wade fishing, you can start to have some really high number days, especially if you're looking to catch and release. Obviously, if you're looking to come catch your 3 fish, have your limit, take them home and eat them, you're going to be better suited for fishing in and around where you can park fairly close by. So you're not having to haul fish up and down the river on a stringer. So that first little hole at Desperado Springs that I put down, that's probably as far as you would want to go if you were trying to keep fish, because there's some good run that comes right there, as well as a little bit downstream that you can walk to that you can cast to with either bait or with artificial lures. So the main part of the property, which is basically from the camping area, which here is a link to where the primary camping area on the property is. And this is going to be on the west side of the river. From here all the way downstream is going to be suited for all types of anglers. You're going to have places that lots of good places to set up to fish with bait, lots of great bank access. All of these areas through here, more than likely, you can fish very close to where your vehicle is, if not from your vehicle itself in some places. So right there at the camp area, there's a good run that goes through that. It's a big, nice pool. You can set up to fish with bait through that. There's also a braided section that you can walk back down and fish. How many days can you camp there on any property? It's 14 consecutive days. And then you have to remove your site. So 14 days consecutive for camping on any wildlife management area in the state that allows camping on it. And then as you move down, kind of the place that most people are really familiar with is the low water crossing. So the low water crossing has a large parking area just before you get to it. And that's where the majority of people who go to Blue River end up at some point. And right here, you're going to have lots of access for people of, all physical levels. There's an ADA pad that you can fish from that's right along the river right there at the crossing. And then upstream, depending on water flow, right now it's probably dry, so you can kind of walk the bank from the low water on the west side and get up to a nice run that comes below a waterfall. And then below that waterfall, or below the low water, those are two areas that get pretty heavily fished, but they're also very heavily stocked. So people looking to throw bait off the bottom or throw lures, those are usually two pretty good spots to get your fish fairly quickly. Now, as you're coming into the main area to the low water crossing, if you were to take a right at the fork before you get to the low water, which is the link that I'm throwing in the chat now, if you were to follow that down to the right, that's going to take you down to the southern boundary of the property. Now, this section through here is great for those who want to go and try to catch fish a few different ways, either by bank fishing, wade fishing, artificial bait. This is the spot that, with the camping areas that run along the bank, as you drive down, there are lots of good runs and holes that are spread out through there, where you can pretty much park your vehicle, hop right down on the river, and you can go catch your fish. And that's going to go as far down. You can follow that road all the way down, and it ends up doing kind of a loop down at the end. And that's pretty much the southern boundary of the property. And so all the water that comes through there is pretty good because it's not too stretched out in these runs. It's also not overly deep. And you can get out on those waterfalls, and there is some braided pocket water that's in there that you can get to. You can also access the river by going across the low water. There's one spot that you can drive through that's all the way at the end of the road from the low water that basically puts you across from where you would end the road on the west side of the river. But all that water through there is pretty good. So does the river run into Texoma? It actually drops into the Red River downstream of Texoma. The limit of 6 is probably not coming back. We're going to keep it at 3. We're still stocking the same amount of fish, but it allows for more opportunity for harvest throughout the course of several days, as the price of trout has increased dramatically over the last several years. The fish that we're paying to stock. So we're trying to get the most value for the most amount of anglers. So I don't foresee us going back to 6 anytime soon. It will probably stay at 3 for a while. So that kind of covers the stretch of the river that you're looking for. If you're looking to bait fish, if you want to bait fish and you want to keep fish, The area that's probably going to work best for you is going to be the area that is just south of the main camping area. So off of the fork of the link that I just showed, or right there at the low water. Those are going to be the easiest access that you have from your vehicle to the river, and you don't have to get in the water if you don't want to. Same goes for if you park in the eastern parking lot, so just across the Highway 7 bridge on the north hand side. There are a couple of holes that are right there outside of the parking area where, again, you could fish with bait from the bank without ever getting in the water. But those are pretty much the two places that you can go if you're not looking to walk or hike, ride a bike, get away from the parking area to go fish. Those are going to be your two best bets. The water is perfect for bait fishing. Really, most of the river is pretty good for bait fishing just because it's a very slow flow. Most of the current is consolidated to tight runs in the braided sections, as well as just below the waterfalls. After you get downstream 15, 20 feet of the waterfalls, that water really slows down as it gets backed up from when it's going to go over its next waterfall. So when you're fishing with bait, trying to find areas that if you can't get directly in the water upstream, so let's say you were fishing at the low water or you were fishing on one of the waterfalls, if you could stand directly on the waterfall, cast downstream, allow your sinker to go straight down to the bottom and you're upstream and you could hold on to your fishing rod, that's a pretty good bet to get your bait down when you're fishing in current. Otherwise, if you're going to be fishing from the bank where you're perpendicular with how the current is running, you're going to want to try to get farther down towards the end of those runs as they start to get closer to either the next braided section or the next waterfall. That way, when you cast downstream, probably 45 degrees, you can hold your weight on the bottom and keep a tight line with your rod tip, which is the most important thing that you can do when you're trout fishing with bait to feel those bites. So right there around the camping area and then just right off of Highway 7 are really the two best areas that you can do for that. There's also one little area right below the Desperado Spring parking lot that also has good bank access like that. But that is a very limited area. And if you're not on the river at first light, odds are there's going to be somebody there. So it can get a little crowded. It also gets crowded down around the parking areas. So if you're the type of angler that's fly fishing or artificial lures, or maybe you will bait fish, but you're not keeping fish, so you're willing to take more of a walk because you don't have to haul those fish around. Um, Looking at that area above Desperado Spring, going down onto the river, walking upstream a quarter mile, and then fishing upstream from there. Same thing goes up towards the catch and release zone. You can move your way a little bit south of the campgrounds by wading, but those are slower runs and they are going to be heavily pressured. So if you're the type of person who's looking to get out and kind of get away from the crowds, the area north of Desperado Spring, walking up quarter of a mile, or going up the walk-in area towards the catch and release zone, or going a ways north of when you're on the east side of Highway 7. That's how you're going to get away from the most amount of people and find areas that fish have been able to concentrate in because they don't get as much pressure. They have been stocked multiple times. So you end up getting more fish per acre up in those types of sections, which can lead to bigger catch rates. And if that's what you're looking for catch and release, if you're not looking to keep, that's what I would recommend. So I'm going to go over just kind of what your best lure options are. Like if you're going to Blue River, you're unfamiliar with the area, maybe you've been there before, you haven't had success. These are the types of things that are really going to put you on fish quickly, help you build confidence to kind of branch out into maybe some other lures or baits that you can use that are also effective. At the beginning of the chat, so up there at the top of the chat bar, are the 4 trout courses that we've recorded the last couple of days that will go into more detail for bait, artificial, fly fishing, and you can look at those and they're going to go into more in depth. So for this, I'm just going to show what my top selections are. While we have the time. So your best trout lure, in my opinion, for just getting out there for catch, cast, straight, steady retrieve, Um, not You're looking for baits for trout that are very simple. Something, especially in a river where there's current, where there's snags, where there's boulders. This time of year, Blue River, the vegetation is down, but you are dealing with significant bottom structure. It is a kind of mixture of silt on top of stone bottom with gaps and cracks that are in there. So there's lots of places where, treble hooks or single hooks, anything with barbs, they're going to be able to find a lot of hangups. And even when you're using small trout lures, they can get expensive quickly. When you're looking at $3, $4 for a hard bait, and you end up in areas where you're snagging and maybe you don't have waders on, or you can't get them back, or even if you do have waders on, they're just in an area where you can't get to. Um, we want to try to keep those lures in your tackle box and in the fish's mouth and not on the bottom of the river. So really one of the best ones is going to be what's called a super duper. So it's just a shaved piece of metal, just like this, comes out of the box, looks just like this. Unlike traditional lures that will come listed in a particular ounce size, super dupers are labeled by number. So 500 is the smallest size, and 503s are the bigger size. So you're going to have 500, 501, 502, and 503. 501 is my favorite. It's going to be your lightest one. It's going to run about a 1/16 of an ounce, and that's what it looks like. This is the 502 that is just a shade bigger. And then we have a 503, which is just a little bit bigger. And then the weight profiles on them. The 503 is noticeably heavier. The 502 and the 501 are fairly weighted the same. But the 501 is really for if you're using light action tackle. So if you have a light action rod, medium light action rod, 2 to 6 pound test, fluorocarbon or monofilament, and you're going to be able to throw that. If you try to throw these lighter ones on a medium action rod with 8 pound, 10 pound test, you're going to struggle to throw them, especially on a spinning reel. You're going to get that line jump that comes off, and you're going to get those dreaded twists and bird's nests and things like that. And if you try to throw it with like a spin casting, one of the button clickers, it's just going to more than likely be too light. Most of those come pre-spooled with 10 pound test, and most of them are medium action. So you're just going to have difficulty throwing the 501. Now, if you upgrade to the 502 or the 503 with medium action rods and 6 to 10 pound tests, you shouldn't have much problems throwing these. And in the rivers, you're looking to throw them 45 degrees upstream, and then just a steady retrieve back to you. And all they're going to do is they're just going to wobble through the water. So they're on this half swivel that doesn't allow them to spin. So they can't spin all the way around on that swivel. They can only rotate back and forth. And that little shaved piece right there is going to collect that water, and it's going to make it go through the water like that and flash. These, for whatever reason with trout, I've always found fishing in Oklahoma for trout, gold seems to be the more productive color. They make these in silver, they make them in chartreuse, they'll make them in like a trout pattern, and then they make them in a gold. And I like the ones in the gold that are called Prism Light, which has this piece of metallic tape on it that gives it that extra flash. Because they do make ones that the front of it just looks like this. It's just going to be a solid gold. Those are going to work as well. The great thing about Blue River is that Scotty's Blue River shop, which I'll throw a link to that, which is just right up the road. That store is great about the trout stuff that they keep in there. They have actually they probably have a more extensive offering of super dupers in their shop than you would find at Bass Pro or Cabela's or Academy. So that's a great place to stop into if if you're not in and around one of the areas that has a big box retailer where you can go get some of like a specialty equipment, like a super duper that you're probably not going to find at like a Walmart or local bait and tackle shops around. Scotty's is going to have almost all of the trout stuff that is discussed in any of these videos. So you can actually just go down there and get your equipment right there on site. But definitely this is the go-to for me if I'm going to be throwing artificial lures. Um, and then just keep in mind the smaller the size, the 500s are going to be a little bit harder to throw. So starting off with the 502 or a 503 and fishing those, probably going to be fine. But with low water flows right now, those 500s and 501s, if you do have the ability to throw them, you're going to be able to stay in the strike zone a little bit longer. And then if for some reason you're reeling too slow, you're not going to be on the bottom as quickly as you would be with those heavier ones. So that's just something to keep in mind. With any artificial lure that you're going to throw out, you're looking to throw cross current and then upstream. With the super dupers, you could throw them straight upstream. You're going to struggle to find bites that way just because they're coming straight back at you, but you can throw them upstream and they will still work the way they're intended to. But you're really looking to cast cross current 45 degrees upstream, slow, steady retrieve back in, let them wobble. You can adjust the speed of the fall as well as the wobble on them. It's typically not necessary. They come right out of the box and look like this. But if you pinch that down towards the bait, that's going to create a tighter wobble and a faster fall. Less water gets through it. You can also pull it and extend it outward like that, and that's going to create more of a wide wobble as well as a slower fall rate because it's going to catch more water on the way down. But typically, they come out of the box, they look just like that. You don't have to mess with them at all. That's why they're great lures. They work well in current. You don't need to worry about things like blades getting stuck and not working as effectively. So that is definitely my number one bait if you're going to go to Blue River, is just your gold Prism Light 501, 502, 503 super duper. Now the next two that are also fairly effective are going to be your rooster tails. And these are my two go-tos right here. This is a green olive one. It's usually packaged as frog. And this brown one over here, which is usually packaged as grasshopper. These are Warden Yakima bait rooster tails. And that is just their labeling. Lots of different companies make inline spinner baits that are similar in color, size, flash, subtle differences, labeled differently by color and by size. An eighth of an ounce, which is right here, versus a 16th of an ounce, which is right here. Just a little bit bigger body profile on our eighth of an ounce. Weight wise, not a huge difference in current. It's not going to make a lot of a difference. Really comes back to what type of equipment are you using. If you're using light action, medium light action gear, 2 to 6 pound test, you should be able to throw the 1/16 ounce. And I always favor the lighter and smaller baits when I can throw them. But if for some reason you have medium action equipment, 8 or 10 pound test, you can throw the 1/8 ounce ones. They're going to work just as fine. Just you're going to reel them just a shade faster to keep them up off the bottom. The thing about these rooster tails when you're fishing them in rivers with current is that the whole point of this bait is to get your inline spinner. So you have your eye hole on a metal shank that runs through the body of the bait, which is loose. So that bait can move up and down just so slightly. So as it goes through the water, it spins and flashes, and then it comes down to a joint where it is connected to the treble hook, which is loose. So the treble hook can move. That blade that's on there is able to rotate around the shank. In order for it to rotate around that correctly, it needs constant pressure on a tight line from your rod tip. So if you are to cast too far upstream and it goes into the water and you're not reeling fast enough to catch up to give tension. So what ends up happening is that blade sucks right onto the body of the bait like this, and you'll be reeling it in, and it's going to be kind of doing this on the way in. What you should feel if you're fishing these correctly is just a nice steady vibration on your rod tip as you're reeling it in. You should be able to feel that blade pulsing as it's going through the water. Now, when you cast upstream into current, which you want to be casting 45 degrees upstream, so as you're retrieving it in, as it gets about halfway in between where you cast it and you, it's then about even with you in the river, which gives you the longest period of time to get that bait in the strike zone. If you were to cast a rooster tail downstream of you or 45 degrees, what's going to end up happening is as that bait gets closer to you and goes out into that thicker current, it's actually going to raise that bait up towards the surface to eventually, depending on how fast the water is running, it will ultimately end up on top of the water. It's no longer effective. So you're just taking it out of the strike zone much too quickly when you go downstream. But when you cast upstream, because it's coming with current, you also have to make sure that you have caught up to the bait. A quick, easy way to ensure that you do that is when you cast it upstream and it hits the water. When you go to snap your bail and engage your reel, do a quick hook set. Doesn't have to be violent or hard like on an actual fish, but snap your wrist in whatever direction to get that rod tip to bend back. And what that'll do is it'll create the tension. So as you pull it and you start to reel, it'll get that blade spinning and you'll feel it immediately. It'll just be that quick. As you snap the rod tip, you'll feel that pulse. And as you reel, you should feel that pulse all the way in. And the great thing about inline spinners, super dupers, is that because they fish on a fairly straight line, you're not jigging them, they're not moving up and down, there's no slack line, you're on a tight, steady retrieve. Your bites are very noticeable, and typically the tension from your rod tip to the bait as you're reeling sets the hook for you. So when that fish hammers it and you're maybe late on your hook set or whatever, because of those treble hooks on the back end of them on thin wire hooks that are very sharp and you're fishing just a steady, tight line, you're usually going to be hooked up to that fish. And that's also why utilizing artificial lures for trout that have rear facing hooks, which means that the hook is the last thing on the bait. Predatory fish like to attack their prey from below and from behind. So anytime where you have baits where the hook is on the top of the bait and in the middle of the bait, a lot of times those fish can come by, they can take a swing, they can hit it side profile, they can short strike it, and they end up missing the hook. So you get that quintessential thump thump of a bite or a hammer, but there's no fish there when you go to set the hook. So rooster tails, inline spinners, deadly effective for trout. Those are my absolute go-to baits that I'm going to use. You can also use spoons, slabs, soft plastic baits. If you check out any of the videos that are up at the top of the chat bar that we recorded the last couple of days, they're going to go much more in depth on artificials and bait and fly fishing equipment that you can use. But for all intents and purposes, if you're going to Blue River sight unseen, or maybe you've been there before, you haven't had success, and you take, a 501 or a 502 or a 503 Gold Super Duper with you, and then you have either a green or a brown rooster tail, 1/8 of an ounce, 1/16 of an ounce, and you can cast it. If you're putting yourself into sections of the river, like I said, looking for areas where trucks can back up to, fishing right below the falls, trout like current. They really don't like to be in stagnant water. So when they are in a river, they are going to favor seam lines. They're going to look for areas where the current is the fastest, and they're going to seek structure or current channel breaks to hide in. So when you're looking at fishing waterfalls, what's below the waterfall? There's going to be boulders or other logs or laydowns, and those trout are going to orient themselves right up alongside or behind where those pieces of structure are in our what are called the seams. So as that heavy current is coming down, when there are impediments to that current, the current has to break off. And as it breaks off, in between what is known as the back eddy or the slack water and that faster moving water is what are known as our seam lines. And it is just an area where there is still some current coming down, but it's not completely slack. Fish are able to rest. They don't want to expend all their energy sitting out in that heavy current to eat. And it gives them easy access either to the slack water to get food or to dart out into the current to grab food as it comes by and then settle right back in. So anytime that you're trout fishing or just river fishing in general for predatory fish like a smallmouth bass or a spotted bass, or your trout, that's where they're going to look to sit. So those are the areas of the river that you really want to focus on. Obviously, any of the big waterfall areas are going to be areas that trucks get to stock. Um, but looking for unique pieces of structure around it so you can position yourself in a way to make the most out of every cast to try to get into as many fish as possible. In those braided pocket areas where there's lots of different like short sections of river in between little islands, again, look for cut banks or look for maybe where the water turns a little bit. And those fish are going to orient themselves in a way where, again, they can jump right back out. Also, tailwater. So anywhere where you have tail outs, where you've come through a big long run and that water kind of gets shallow and a little bit faster as it's moving either to go over a waterfall or turn back into more braided areas, those are also sections of the river that will hold fish because they can sit back and basically all the food that's come down river in that section starts to narrow in to the tail out into that faster moving water as it goes. And those fish will kind of dart in and out of that faster moving water. So those are kind of the places that you want to look for. Now, as far as like if you were to go fly fishing at the Blue River, what you would be looking for, woolly buggers, olive brown are usually something with a bead head on it. That's going to be your kind of stock, what you would look for. You may have some success with either mayfly or caddis hatches, but if you're fly fishing, sticking to size 6 to size 10 woolly buggers, especially if they got rubber legs. If you were to try nymphing, pretty standard, prince nymphs, pheasant tails, any type of caddis or mayfly nymph, keep it small, size 16, 18. Rubber legs are always a bonus, rubber legged yellow sallies. And then midges up in the film. A lot of times when you see fish will rise at Blue River, they're not actually hitting the surface. They're coming up and they're getting those subsurface midges. So zebra midges, purple midges, things like that, that you can throw right up in the film. Those are going to be your most effective. Now, for bait anglers, if you're looking to get out there, your most effective setup is going to be with a casting sinker fishing off the bottom. And I'll show that really quick. This is going to work anywhere where you go to trout fish. Really, the only difference is the size of the weight you're going to use based on wind and current. So if you go to Blue River, I always try to go as light on my casting weight as possible. But because it is going to slide up and down your main line, you may need to go up as heavy as maybe a half an ounce. I would probably start, this is a quarter ounce. This is what I would start with. And when you go to fish with bait, if you're not going to be standing directly on top of a waterfall, fishing dead downstream of you, where you can keep a tight line. If you're fishing from the bank and you're casting out, you're going to want to kind of get farther downstream of those waterfalls where that water starts to slack out a little bit. If you try to cast directly perpendicular into where the heaviest current of the waterfall, it's just going to take your weight and it's going to swing it and it's going to swing it and it's going to swing it and it's eventually going to end up back down on the bait. You want to get down towards the tail out sections where that current slows down and cast 45 degrees downstream, keeping your rod tip elevated with either a rod holder or in your hand or propped up against something to keep that line as high as you can to when it hits the water, so that when this hits and you go to reel up to get that slack out, you're nice and tight and you're still out in the middle of the river as opposed to being right up against the bank, or with too much slack in your line. So what you're looking for is either a small treble hook. This is a size 14, or a very small octopus, mosquito, or salmon egg hook. Different brands label them different, but you're looking for a size 8, 10, 12 single point hook, or a size 10, 12, probably closer to like a 14 treble hook. So what you're going to do is you're going to take your casting weight. If this is the line that's coming off of your rod and reel, you're going to slide that through the eye hole of the weight. Now, if you use a single point hook instead of a treble hook, something like this, you could actually tie your hook on first and then use the casting weight. So we'll do that. Um, we put that single point hook on our line and we tie that on first because it is a single point hook and because the eye hole on the casting weight is large enough, we can actually just slide the weight up over the hook. Which this is a great way to do this if you plan on trout fishing maybe multiple times with the same rod, but you have to travel with the rod and you're not going to break it down or take all your equipment apart. You don't want that weight on your line when you're traveling in your car or however you have it because it's going to bang around on um, a lot of different things, and you can break eye guides and other things like that. So you always want to be able to get that heavy weight off if it's not the hook itself or the lure itself. So if we had our hook, we're tied on to our line, you can just take the sinker and then just work it onto the hook onto the line. That way you don't have to fight the sinker when you're tying on the hook. Then all you got to do is take a very small piece of split shot, just big enough that it can block the eye hole of that weight. And then in between your hook and where your weight is on your main line, you're just going to crimp down, piece of split shot, typically somewhere between 8 and 16 inches above your hook. So that's going to stop our weight from coming down towards our hook. And then you're going to want to utilize some type of either floating power egg, like a salmon egg. These are gulp, something like that, or some type of paste. Power bait, dough bait, color, scent, all that, up to you as the angler. I find them all to be effective. I don't think any one fish is better than the other. But that's what anglers do, is they'll argue over that till the death. But what you want to do if you're using the paste is just scoop out just enough to cover your fingertip, because all we're trying to do is just cover that hook. This is a floating, so you want to get enough to cover the hook, but not so much that it's a huge daub around it, because then the fish can actually steal that bait from you. And you just want to wrap it around until you have the hook completely covered and you're in kind of an oval egg or teardrop shape, just like that. So when you cast out, your weight is going to sink down to the bottom, and then your power bait is going to float. So when it's on the bottom, like this, your power bait is going to float up, and the height that it's going to come up off the bottom is determined by our piece of split shot right here. So if you want to get lower off the bottom, then you would just pull that down to where we're, now we're only about 4 inches off the bottom. And you can adjust that. Now, this is the best way, because with split shot, when you're done fishing for the day and you're done with that power bait and everything, and you want to put your rod and reel away, but you don't want to be putting your hook on your eye guide or on your bait holding clip, or however you connect it back to your rod when you're done fishing. If you were to connect that, then you're going to have this 1/4 ounce or 1/2 ounce or 3/8 ounce weight that's going to bang on your rod deck. It's going to bang on eye guides. It could even break something else that's in your vehicle. So being able to take a piece of split shot, which is completely expendable, and you pop that off, and then you can just pull your weight down and then take your weight off, and then you just connect your hook. Now you don't have to worry about anything when you go and you store your rod away. So that's kind of your most effective baits and lures to use. We got about 5 minutes left here. If anybody's got any more questions, I see what size trout are stocked in this area. So trout stocking is at random. We pay per pound of fish. So typically you're looking at an average stocking size of about a 1/2 pound fish. So you're looking at somewhere between 8 and 14 inches being the most commonly stocked size of fish. But we also do have brooder fish that are mixed in, which are going to be fish that are over 14 inches. And in a lot of cases, they're over 16 inches. So But your average size fish is going to be right around 12, maybe 14 inches. They could get as little as 7 or 8 inches, and they could get as big as potentially up to like 24 inches. But the majority of the fish that you're going to catch in any of our trout areas, especially the seasonal ones and at a blue river, are going to be in that 8 to 14 inch range. Now, Blue River does have a annual trout derby that they do down there. They might, I think they might actually do two now. Anyways, when they do those trout derbies, the promoters of the trout derbies do private stockings of the river, and we allow for that. So they do actually put in some bigger fish, some of which are tagged for those events for prizes. So a lot of those fish end up in there as well post the tournament. So there is going to be a healthy smattering throughout the river of some fish that are over 14 inches, which when they get to that size, they're going to run anywhere from 1 to 4 pounds, depending on, the size of them. But a big fish coming out of the Blue River is going to be 4 or 5 pounds. That fish is going to be well over 20 inches. And then you're going to catch what are typically good stalker size, which is going to be a 14 to 16 inch fish. And those are easy to fillet, and those are just good eater fish. But that's kind of the average expected size that you should have when you go to trout fish, is going to be somewhere in that 12 to 14 inch range. Anybody else have any questions? We got a few more minutes. The biggest thing I can give with Blue River, it's a great public site. It's unlike almost any other property that we have in the state of Oklahoma, because we have 6 continuous river miles. That in those river miles, unlike the lower Illinois, for example, which is broken up, where we have the river itself, but we don't have the property adjacent to it, that becomes a little bit more difficult for the fishing, because you have the Kerr WMA down at the end, and then you have the watch unit and the dam up at the north end, and then it's got private property in the middle. So you can float, but you can't wade and you don't have access. Whereas the Blue River, you pretty much have 6.5 miles of trail that are on the public river the entire time, which makes it a really unique property. When is the Derby? The big one that I'm always aware of is usually President's Day weekend, but I think that there is 2 out there annually. But I know that one of the big ones is typically on President's Day weekend, which is usually the what would that be? The third week in February, second or third week in February is when they have that one. Which again, with seasonal trout fisheries, most of these fisheries get better as the year goes on when they're seasonal. So always something to think about. If you're going to go to Blue River early season, November, even into December, you really are going to want to look for those areas where the trucks were able to back up to. If you can find those spots in good positions for whatever type of fishing you're doing, those are the spots that you're going to want to look to first. And then identifying areas where trout like to live, which are going to be in the oxygen rich, right off of the current in those seam lines. So, you look at a big waterfall and it all looks the same. What's directly below it? There might be 2 boulders in 2 unique places, and you want to be casting to either sides of those boulders to start with, and trying to pick off fish in those ways. And then there's going to be other sections where fish get stocked into areas that aren't really habitat friendly for trout. It's more like a swimming pool for them. And in those cases, fan casting around and looking for fish, that's how you'll get into a lot of them. But Blue River is kind of feast or famine, as I found over the years. So it's always, if you're bait fishing, going somewhere right to a big long run, especially near the camping areas that get heavily stocked, those are going to be your best bets. But if you're fly fishing or artificial fishing, or even using bait, but you're catch and release, you want to have the ability to move around often. Those fish, as they get kind of dispersed throughout the river, you're going to find pockets that hold a lot of fish. It's just how it goes. You'll end up in a section where it's like you'll hit 5, 6 fish in a row and then nothing. You'll fish water that looks exactly like it in another area that maybe is farther away from where a truck could have got to, or maybe it's separated by natural barriers that fish can't even get into. And you're making casts and you're not having as much success. So being able to move around often and just kind of hit the heads of those waterfalls and then the tail out sections and then any type of braided water that's in between, that sets up more traditional river type fishing where you do have a current that's coming through, where there is a piece of structure, there is a piece of cut bank, that's going to create those feeding lanes. Otherwise, you're looking at areas that are fairly um, benign looking. They're just, you have a waterfall, it dumps in, you can't see the bottom, it's deep, it's slow, it's stagnant, it runs for 100 yards and then it hits another waterfall. Those are the types of areas where you might be able to set up along the bank in a chair and bait fish. Throw something out there. You throw power bait out, you could throw worms. Power bait is probably going to be your best bet. Kernels of corn, people have success on that as well. Um, but those are going to be the types of locations that you're looking for. So with that, we're up on an hour. If you received the link to this through the email, then you have all my information. If you just hopped on because you saw us doing a live feed, you can go to wildlifedepartment.com, go to our fishing resources page. My contact information is down there at the bottom. Please feel free to call, text, email if you have any questions. The purpose of these are to try to get you on as many fish and build that confidence. Fishing's never fun when you go out there and for whatever reason you feel like everybody else is catching fish and you're not. These are kind of geared towards the very basics, what works well, where it works, when it works. And if are new to trout fishing, new to Blue River, you're super duper, your inline spinner, if you're an artificial angler, that's where you're going to find the most success immediately. From there, the options are limitless. There's spoons, there's slabs, there's different types of inline spinners. There's all different sorts of baits and lures for trout. But these ones have proved time and time again that no matter the skill level of the angler, the age of the angler, these baits find success year after year in the same places. Same thing goes for bait fishing. Utilizing a salmon egg or a power bait floating in any of the colors, utilizing a casting sinker with a piece of split shot and a small hook, making sure that you're putting just enough power bait onto your hook to cover it. That's going to get you bit the most often. It's also going to lead to more successful hookups. When it comes to fly fishing, steering clear of more of the traditional fly fishing values of matching the hatch and things like that, because these are seasonal stocked fish. They've all been raised on pellets and fish food. So they're going into an environment where they are attempting to learn to survive in something that they are not really well equipped to survive in. So power bait in pellet form is really always the best bet for seasonal trout fishing in Oklahoma, because it most closely resembles what their food source was prior to getting stocked. As they become more comfortable in the river system and start to adjust, their primal instincts are kicking in and they're starting to look for things that look like food, which are going to be small bait fish, insects. So that way, that inline spinners, super dupers, things that are very simple but very natural that give off flash, they're going to have the most success. They're going to create the most strikes. But it's not to say that you can't throw on a hot pink inline spinner or a bright green spoon and not catch fish. There's going to be days where that flashy color, fish are active, they're willing to just be aggressive and take bites. But for the most part, if you stick with golds and then natural greens, browns, blacks, maybe white, with inline spinners with a gold blade, you're going to pick up bites more often. Same thing goes for fly fishing with woolly buggers with either rubber legs or utilizing pheasant tail nymphs, things that are just very common bugs. Oklahoma is got caddis and we have mayflies, and these fish were raised in hatcheries where they more than likely, they're coming from the region. And outside of Kansas and Nebraska and Arkansas and Missouri, depending on the year of wherever we get the trout from. So they're in similar environments to us. So they're going to see these types of bugs in their hatchery environments as well. But that's what you're looking for when you go to seasonal trout fisheries. The lower Mountain Fork is the one river that we're doing a course on at 3 p.m. this afternoon. If you have interest in that, where there are um, more kind of tried and true trout principles for fishing for wild trout, as opposed to all of our other fisheries, even the lower Illinois, because we don't see reproductive success because of the tailwater dynamics and the water quality and temperature of that river. We're really only looking at carryover. So those fish are going to become more wild, but they were still hatchery fish at one time, and they don't have the second generation that were born wild, which is what happens in the lower Mountain Fork. And so the fishing there gets a little bit tougher in certain situations for those second generation, third, fourth, fifth generation fish that are then wild, that then really are keying in on, the natural elements of matching a hatch, matching the particular bait fish that exists, or the any of the food sources. So those are really, you're really just trying to key in on these stocked fishes, behavioral patterns, which for the most part is going to be pellets. Medicine Park, it's going to be the same way. Medicine Park is going to fish more like a pond or a lake than it doesn't have the same type of current that Blue River does. But really, at any seasonal fishery, Blue River is just one that has so much public access that you kind of have to break down the sections. But you go to any of our seasonal fisheries, especially in the little creeks or ponds, starting with super dupers and inline spinners, or utilizing power bait fished off the bottom. Those should be your three go-to right out of the car. Like, that's what you're using. From there, you can kind of start to go down the rabbit hole of spoons or slabs, or different types of soft plastics, or different types of bait combinations. And again, we have those courses that we've already recorded this week up at the top of the chat bar on this course. So you can click on those. If you can't find them when this chat is over with, going to our Outdoor Oklahoma channel here on YouTube, clicking on our playlist, and go into the Ask an Angler. And we have over 30 videos on there, lots of trout info as well, and then the ones dealing with these seasonal fisheries. So you're going to be able to find the bits and pieces of information. But if you ever have questions, if you ever need to talk to somebody, if you want just some very specific type of advice or information for something that is more specific than some of the generalities that we covered in this, feel free to reach out to me. That's what I'm here for. I want to put you guys on fish, help you catch fish, help you build more into the sport of fishing. And in the long term, that helps us as an agency, and that helps the sport, and it helps preserve these public areas that we're able to have these opportunities to go out and fish. So, without you guys, none of this is possible. So always remember that. You're our biggest advocate. So whatever we can do to help you be more successful at your outdoor experiences is what we're here to do and committed to. So anything that you need, feel free to reach out, and we'll get you set in the right direction. Other than that, we've got our lower Illinois course coming up here at 1 p.m. and our Mountain Fork course coming up at 3 p.m. So if you didn't register for those, but you want to tune in, just come back to our channel at 1 or 3, and those live feeds will be going on. Other than that, thanks for coming. Enjoy your holidays, stay safe, and happy trout fishing.